I believe it was published in 1978, and I started working on it, I believe, in 1974. But I wasn't working on it full time. Obviously, I make my living by writing things, and so I've got to be writing something that is going to sell fairly quickly. And I knew with the making of jazz that this was a labor of love. Nobody makes a lot of money out of jazz, except Wynton Marsalis. And so I did this because I love the music. I've been playing the music since I was 12 years old. And I just wanted to do this for my own enjoyment. But it was, of course, very interesting to do because I had to go back and listen to all the records. And I made a point of, I really spent more time listening to the music than I did actually writing the book. Because while I'd heard all this stuff, all the Armstrong and Lester Young and everything, I've been hearing this stuff for many years, I hadn't actually sat down and studied it and listened to it carefully and play it over and over again and move the needle back in the groove to, because we still had that in those days, to repeat passages and transcribe some stuff, you know, occasionally if I felt I needed to understand it a little better. So that was the great thing, and I enjoyed that. I would tell myself, you know what I'm going to do for a living this morning? I'm going to listen to Louis Armstrong records. So that was a very nice way to make a living. But of course, the making of jazz, I made enough money. I have made enough money out of it over the years, maybe to just about pay for the time that I put into it. But it certainly was not highly profitable. Oh, I got terrific reviews. I was very happy about that. Terrific reviews, and I think partly because I brought something to this that a lot of the people who have written about jazz don't have. I'm a professional writer. I've made my living for many, many years doing this, so I knew how a book was put together. I knew exactly how to go about creating the kind of book I wanted to make. But I also, there are a lot of, fewer now, but at that time, there were a lot of jazz writers who really didn't understand music. They had no background in music at all. And while I don't claim to be a great musician, which I'm not, but I have know something about theory. I can hear music up to a point the way a musician does. And so I could bring that to the work. And then finally, I have a brother who is quite a well-known historian, a professional historian, and he and I worked together on some books, American history sorts of books. And so I learned what a historian does, what kinds of proofs that a historian needs to have to be sure that what he's saying is correct. The past is gone. You can't go and look at it. So you have to get that from documents, from books, from papers, from whatever else you have. And so I learned that the historical method. So I came to it, luckily, just by chance, no great virtue on my part, but with the right tools to do this kind of thing. And the result was that the book was very well taken, and I'm very happy about that. Oh, I can't even tell you, and I don't actually know, because, for example, the book was published in Russian, and somebody told me there that they had sold 50,000 copies of it. And I don't know whether to believe that or not, but there's no way for me to find out. I will never know how many copies that book sold in Russia. So you're talking about hundreds of thousands of copies of the book, but I can't really tell you. Well, that, of course, is what a historian does. You're not supposed to be making value judgments. You're supposed to say, okay, let's look and see what was being done at that time, and lay it out for the readers. Here's what the records were. Here were the styles that were being played. Here were the musicians who seemed to be important, and equally, here are some musicians that perhaps have been overlooked. But you try and keep a level hand in looking at all of these things, and deal with each area as for what it was at the time. You also try and look at the audience that was going on for the music at that time. Obviously, the swing bands had a very large popular audience. Free jazz had a rather small audience. So you bring that into the equation. You tell your readers about what the audience was at any particular time. So it's really the historical method. Well, I think I was guessing like anybody else who gets into these things, because you can't predict the future. You just don't know. But looking at the past, you hope that that's going to give some indication of the direction that things are going in, and will allow you to make some guesses about what might be coming. And how accurate I was, I don't know. But um, some of it, I think, probably has come true.
But do you think
Back to this, I've always been very interested in human behavior, and I've studied a lot about human behavior, and I've studied a lot about uh, how people have looked at this from a psychological viewpoint, from a sociological viewpoint, and so forth and so on. I've always, just for my own interest, I've always had that kinds of doing that kind of reading, and fortunately, doing a lot of magazine writing at that time when the magazines were very profitable. You were always being sent someplace. I'd go to New Orleans, or go to Los Angeles, or go someplace to work on stories. And I'd always take advantage of these trips to interview people in jazz who were interesting to me. So then I began collecting a lot of interviews and a lot of information, which I sort of stored away. When I was very much younger, I always wanted to travel. I mean, it was 12, 13, 14 years old, I wanted to travel. I don't know why I got that travel bug. A lot of my family had no interest in it at all. My mother and father never did much traveling. But I wanted to travel. And then, like a lot of people, I inadvertently got married and had children, and I was in my 20s, and so that kept me pretty much tied down for a while. And but finally, I got an opportunity to go to Russia, and in connection with my with some writing I was doing, and so that sprung me loose in a certain sense. And then my wife at the time and I and our small children moved to London, and we were living in London. And from London, I was going on to the continent to work on magazine articles. I was writing for a number of magazines, and I was working on the magazine articles. And this again gave me an opportunity to see quite a lot of the world. And in the end, I certainly visited every country in Europe many times, and most of the major cities and so forth. So I wanted to travel, and I have had the opportunity to travel. And that, of course, brought me into contact with a lot of jazz musicians, because I would make a point of calling up or getting to meet the local jazz critics, the musicians, whatever I could, and talk to them. And it did give me some background then in what was going on in Europe. John Chilton, an excellent jazz writer, an English guy, was one of the first people I met there, and he was just very good about introducing me to people, about sitting and spending time with me to develop what was going on in Europe. As I think you know, most American jazz people think jazz is America, that's all there is to it, and what goes on in the rest of the world is not important. Well, that's obviously not true. And so I had that, having done a lot of traveling because of my writing, uh, I had a better sense of the importance of Europe and the role it played in the development of jazz, and was able to write something about that. Well, that's a tough question because the differences are subtle. Um, I think, and this is a very hard one to talk about, but I think the nature of swing itself is somewhat different in Europe from what it is in the United States. I've done some very close studies of swing, what swing actually is, the swing beat, working with one of my sons who's an authority on the psychology of some of these things, and we set some records up on some advanced equipment that he has, and we were able to break down a beat into 1,000 parts, so we could look at tiny, tiny fractions of a beat and see what was going on. So in doing this and with working some of these things, I did conclude that the swing patterns were a little bit different from Europe and what we have in the United States. Uh, Contrary to what nearly everybody believes, the swing beat is not a dotted quarter and an eighth, which is the way it's sometimes written, or it's not 2/8, which is also a way that it's sometimes written, but it's somewhere in between those two. It's about 2/3 to 1/3. The swing players divide a beat in that sense, and that's where you get the sense of swing. But this, again, is subject to a lot of qualifications because different players do it differently. At different periods in the life, the players may do it one way when they're young and a little differently when they're older, and so forth and so on. But it was a fascinating thing to study this. And what I did see is that the Europeans were a little more consistent in doing the thing that they did. And it was a little more uh, towards a standard European tempo and not quite the same jazz swing that we had here. Now, that's not to say that it's worse, but that there were these minute differences in there which are very subtle and very hard to describe. Um, but then there are a lot of other things in the European situation. The United States is one nation. You've got 20, 30, depending on what period you're talking about, of countries over there speaking different languages. In the United States, jazz is universal. It's pretty much the same anywhere you go. You're going to have avant-garde jazz. You're going to go to New Orleans. You're going to have avant-garde. You're going to have all different kinds. You go to New York, you're going to have all different kinds and so forth. But in Europe, it's constantly being tempered by the individual proclivities of a given country, and so that you get a lot more variety in an approach to jazz in general and to the swing beat in particular. Now, we weren't hearing Django Reinhardt in the United States until long after he had been established as an important figure in in Europe. So that the influence of Django Reinhardt on American guitar players didn't come until really after the Second World War. And then American soldiers who had been in Europe began hearing Django. Now, I don't mean we had never heard of Django before that, because uh, there was some interest, some understanding of who he was earlier. But the real influence of Django Reinhardt in the United States came a lot later than it happened in Europe. There's a great there's a great difference. The American Most of the American jazz people were not scholars. They were people who were deeply interested in jazz, studied it, knew it very well. knew a great deal about it, but they weren't, as I've said, bringing an academic approach to it. In Europe, you got much more of the academic approach and an understanding of it from a more scholarly position. And the consequence of that is that you got a lot of writing about jazz in Europe before we were getting that much here. Now, it has often been said that people like the Belgian, right, and some of those, the Panassier book particularly has been cried up as the first important writing about jazz. That's not true. In some of my studies, I went back and looked at everything, pretty much everything that had ever been published in the United States about jazz in the early days, in the 1920s. And there was quite a lot being written in magazines about it. And some of it very bad, of course, but some of it was quite good. And you had people like Robert Donaldson Darrell, who nobody in the United States ever heard of, and nobody in Europe has ever heard of. He was the first jazz critic anywhere. He should be a very important figure. He should be very well known. He isn't. I've written about him, and he was still alive when I was doing this work, so I interviewed him several times and talked to him about his early writing about jazz. And he was the first one, for example, who cottoned on to what Duke Ellington was doing. He was writing about Duke Ellington when nobody else was, really was touching upon Ellington in that fashion. He was writing for a little American magazine called Disque. It's a French name, but it was being published in Philadelphia. I think Philadelphia. It was being published in the United States. And he was writing reviews. A very interesting guy. He said, I didn't know anything about jazz. My background was all in classical music. But I had to cover it. I had to cover what I thought was popular music for this little magazine I was writing for. So he was opening up boxes of records and just playing them. And suddenly he began hearing Ellington, and he began hearing the Mooch, and he began hearing some of those very early Ellington pieces. And he said, wow, there's something going on here I've got to find out about. So he then began writing seriously about jazz. And so my point is that there were people in the United States writing seriously about jazz, but we didn't have anybody writing books. And while the Panassier book was, I think, has been criticized for a lot of flaws, it did have a lot of flaws, but at least he was writing a book. And you had people like Delaunay and some other people who I interviewed later on, who were doing writing about jazz in a way that the Americans weren't. I started thinking about that when I began spending some time in Europe. And that was mainly, I was living in England in 1969, 1970. So I was crossing the channel and I was getting over to Europe a lot, as I've said, for the purpose of writing various things. And I began to see that there was a lot more jazz going down in Europe than Americans were really aware of. And so I thought, well, this calls for a book. And there's plenty to write about. And so eventually, I began trying to pull something together. A history of jazz in Europe should be mandatory reading for students of jazz. I mean, that seems obvious on the face of it. But here are all these students of jazz in Europe, and there's a lot of them. I don't know how many thousands, but many thousands. And they don't have a history of their own jazz to study. They're studying the history of American jazz. Well, that's fine. They should. I mean, obviously, you have to know about American jazz or about the jazz that was going on in America. But why not study? Why not study your own stuff as well? And so that's why I've taken an interest in trying to develop a history of European jazz. Well, I think what what you have happening is it's once more an evolution, and as happened, as Darwin had points out about the evolution of species, uh, if if a species begins to change and change, it reaches the point where it's no longer a duck, now it's a dog, or whatever. In other words, the development, the evolution of the species reaches the point where you really have a different species. And that can be studied because what happens is that they no longer can interbreed. You've reached sufficient change in the species so that it would not be able to interbreed with the earlier versions of that same species. And we're now reaching a point in jazz where it may be evolving beyond the point where it's fair to call it jazz anymore. It needs to be re-examined and called something else. Now, I'm not saying that this is definitely happening, but this is one of the patterns that jazz is likely to follow. It will evolve to the point where now you've got something quite different from what it originally was and needs to be treated differently. I think that the conservatories and the education of jazz, I think, is very important. Obviously, I'm very happy to see this attention being paid to the music, and that's great. But one of the things that has been very recently said, something I read very recently, was that, okay, you've got these tens of thousands of jazz students, but most of them are not becoming a jazz audience. Which was contrary to what we all thought. We thought that these young people are going to be studying jazz, and so they'll want to go out there and be buying jazz CDs. They'll want to be going to clubs. They'll want to be hearing concerts of jazz, whatever. It hasn't happened. So that the jazz audience it remains about the same size it was. You have a great body of young people who have studied jazz, but okay, so they know something about it and they may value it, but they're not going out to the clubs. Now, partly that's due to the fact that young people don't have the money. You can't expect that. People, particularly retired people, older retired people, they don't have children to support anymore. They can afford to go to a club and go to concerts, go to whatever. And young people do have a problem there because they mostly are not, they have a lot of uses for their money, and jazz isn't going to necessarily be it. But the audience for ballet is not huge either. The audience for opera is not huge. We have opera being presented in the United States, but there are, I think, many cities in the United States where they don't even have an opera. So that sort of goes with the turf. The opera, you have to expect that in any of these art forms, you're never going to have a mass popular audience. I mean, the last time we had a mass popular audience for jazz, well, we had it in the swing band era, and then when you had people like Dave Brubeck and so forth who crossed over and got a larger audience. But basically, a jazz player just can't expect that he or she is going to get wealthy from playing the music. Well, I can go on talking about jazz for hours, so you don't want to get me going. There's so much to say about it, and that I've written a lot about it. I've written whole biographies of Armstrong and Benny Goodman and other people. You can certainly write a whole book about these people, and you still haven't said everything that there is to say. So there's a great deal, that you can always say about jazz. I love the music. I find the subject fascinating. I'm interested in the whole thing, and having music in my life has meant a great deal to me. It's been a big part of my life. So, I'd like to see the kids out there getting something, and instead of this constant superficial music where where you're doing something else while the music is playing, and instead of listening to music, I like to listen to it. I, I, I don't just turn it on and leave some jazz going, or classical music, whatever, Bach, whatever. I sit down or lie down on the sofa and I listen to it. And that's important part of my life. That's something I just vastly enjoy doing.